Thank you to all my channel members, including my fan appreciation level members and my contributor level members, for helping support the YouTube channel. Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the historical fiction book, The Evening and the Morning by Ken Follett. This is another one of his massive historical fiction books set in England around the town of Kingsbridge, although the town of Kingsbridge does not exist in this book, and it actually gets formed in this book, and you see how it gets formed. This is a prequel to Pillars of the Earth, and so I've read this now, the fourth book in the series that I've read. We had the original Pillars of the Earth, the epic, awesome, sweeping book, my favorite book that I read last year. It's absolutely incredible. And I also read World Without End, which is set, about 200 years later. Pillars of the Earth is set in the 1100s, and then World Without End set in the 1300s. Another superb, fantastic historical fiction. And then, keeping it going, set another 200 years later, in the 1500s, you have A Column of Fire, which is another superb, fantastic historical fiction. Although this one breaks the mold a little bit, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you have The Evening and the Morning, which is a prequel. This one's set in the late 900s. It starts at like 996 and goes, or maybe 997, and goes till about the year 1008. So this actually has the shortest span of all the books in the series. The others, Pillars of the Earth takes place over something like 60 or 70 years. Same with World Without End. Same with A Column of Fire. This book is just it's about a 10 or 11 year span. So it's a much more contained story. Also, I want to point out that each book is pretty much shorter than the last in terms of number of words per page. I went through and looked, and at least on my copies, Pillars of the Earth has about 42 lines per page, which is a lot. That's a lot of lines per page. And then World Without End had about 39. That's still a lot of words per page. Then you had A Column of Fire, which has about 33 lines per page. This is more standard from what I've seen from any book that's hardcover. And then you have The Evening and the Morning, only has 29 lines per page. All four of the books are 900 to 1,000 pages. And yet, you can tell that the word count per book is diminishing greatly because of the font size getting larger and the spacing getting larger and whatnot. So this book, in reality, I looked it up, is about 220,000 words, whereas World Without End is like 400,000 words. Yet they're both about the same number of page count. Just want to point that out. So I read this book in 2 days. I got up Saturday morning, started reading it, and spent most of Saturday reading the book. I spent most of the day just glued to the book. I would read for an hour or two, then I'd go and do a chore. And then I'd read for an hour or two, and then I'd go and make lunch. And then I'd read for an hour or two, and then I'd go take a nap. And then I'd read for an hour. Like, I basically did that all Saturday. And then Sunday, I did something very similar. I didn't read quite as much on Sunday. I read, 600 pages Saturday, about 300 pages on Sunday. And it's just really, epic book. I just was so glued to it and enraptured by it. This book is set, as I mentioned, in the late 900s, like 997, and is about the Viking era. The Vikings are kind of present, but it's more about the threat of the Vikings in this book. What's been happening is the Vikings are raiding these English settlements, and so the English decide to try fortifying their settlements. They've mostly had settlements made out of wood, and they start realizing maybe we should build settlements out of stone that are more fortifiable, and that's why they start going from just little fishing villages or farming villages, and they start expanding to becoming actual towns and cities so that they can stop the Vikings. Because a lot of British advancement just dead stopped when the Romans left, when the Roman Empire fell, and then it would take a while for it to kind of get back going again. So that part of the book was really fascinating, learning about the Viking era and stuff. And Ken Follett even talks in the book how there's not too much records left of this era, just because not much was written down, and what little we have is not all historical. So it's very hard to know everything that happened. So he does make some assumptions in the book, but still, it's a very it's still a very entertaining book. And this book goes back to the formula that the first two books had. A Column of Fire broke the formula because it is big and is large scale. You're focusing on like the kings and queens, and you're focusing on the world politics. You're sending out of England. So much of the story is in France and Spain and is in the New World, and a lot of it's in Kingsbridge in England, fair, but so much of it is outside. Whereas you look at Pillars of the Earth and World Without End, the majority of the books take place in Kingsbridge or the Kingsbridge area, and then occasionally a character will travel out for something, and then they come back. And so it's not like the majority of the book is set outside of England. So that's why those books are much more character-based, because it's much smaller scale. Whereas Column of Fire felt like I was reading this big book that was making all these historical connections, which I loved. I loved all the historical stuff in this book. The stuff with the Protestants and Catholics and all that stuff I thought was great, but it just felt out of place in a Kingsbridge novel. Whereas this book returns to the formula. It's very much like the first two books. The types of characters, the villains in this book are like the villains in Pillars of the Earth and World Without End. The main characters in this book are like the main characters of Pillars of the Earth and World Without End. So it's very much following the formula. And if you're someone who doesn't like formulas, you might get tired of this. But if you're someone who goes, hey, there's a reason the formula works and why it's a formula, it's because it's so entertaining, you'll probably still enjoy this, like I did. I think that my favorite character in the book has to be the character of Aldred, who is this monk who is basically trying to uphold moral standards. And the irony of this is that he struggles with temptation. And it's such a fascinating theme to be discussed, was the struggle with temptation, because I believe that Ken Follett was actually trying to portray a different theme with Aldred, and I think that he inadvertently created the theme that I got out of it, which is really fascinating. So Aldred is this monk who is trying to stop the evil Winston from gaining more power. He's trying to help out the people. He's trying to return people to moral, their moral lives. He's trying to promote Christianity and follow actual Christian precepts, because so many people are not following them. Yet he has a big struggle with temptation, especially with the concept of homosexuality. And yet he has sinned, but the whole book is about him resisting that temptation. And his story, which he's not the main character, he's definitely like in the top. He's definitely the third main character behind the other two that I'll talk about in a moment. But I latched onto his story because I appreciated Follett being able to explore the concept of resisting temptation. All humans have temptation, but it's about how do you act on it? How do you react to it? And rather than give in to his temptation, like every other character in this book pretty much, Aldred actually tries to resist and tries to rely on God to help him out. And I just thought that was so fascinating. And he admits on his own power, he cannot resist that temptation, but him relying on God is what helps him. And I loved that in the book, and I thought it was so excellently done. So I loved the character of Aldred. We also have two other main POV characters. There's a lot of POV characters, but the two main ones. There's the three ones. You have Aldred, who I talked about. Then you have the character of Ragna and the character of Edgar. Edgar is the one you're introduced at the beginning of the book. He's the one that his family's poor and destitute. He's a boat builder. He ends up going to become a farmer, but then he doesn't love being a farmer, and he doesn't really want to be around his brothers, who are kind of weird. Their situation with their wife is weird. Anyway, so Edgar decides to focus on boat building and bridge building and stuff, hence the name Kingsbridge, and he starts, helping out Aldred build the town of Kingsbridge, or as it would become Kingsbridge later on. And I loved his character, and he also, again, struggles with temptation, although Edgar is much more prone to giving in to temptation than I would like, but he still, he struggles with it and even tries to resist throughout the book, which I overall found his character very, very compelling. Although there were a few times I was like, oh man, you were so close, man. But he also is, trying to get over the loss of the woman that he loved, who died at the beginning of the book. Then you have the character of Ragna, and Ragna is probably the character who has the most page time, and I would also say she's the character who is the most empathetic towards. She goes through a lot of the things that the women in other books, like Karis in World Without End, like Alina in Pillars of the Earth, she goes through these hardships of being married to some really bad guys, and you just really empathize with her character and her journey. She is just someone that wants to marry for love. And so she's from France originally, and she goes to marry this Englishman, and life is just terrible. He treats her terribly. He is just, he's just a despicable guy. And then things happen to him, and she ends up being forced to marry another person in his family, and it's even worse. And then, just life is just so cruel to Ragna. And again, I've heard that people like Mike from Mike's Book Reviews describe this series as real-life grimdark. He's absolutely correct. And Ragna is the perfect example of real-life grimdark in this series. And it's very hard to read her story, but you empathize with her so much. And she just wants to not only be a good mother, but she also wants to lead. She has natural good abilities as a leader. And she doesn't necessarily just want to take over all the leadership role as a noblewoman. She wants to rule with her husband. And yet she is not given that opportunity to be a partner to him. And you really empathize with her character. There's also the discussion of how to have good government, about working with people who will be empathetic towards you and trying to build coalitions and things like that, and how to make people really respect you. And there's two things. There's the people, you have Winston, who's, I'd say, the primary antagonist of the book. There's three brothers. You have Wolf, you have Winston, and you have Wiglum, and they're all terrible guys. They're all brothers. They're all terrible. And Winston is like he's the middle brother, but he's the primary villain of the book. He is a monk/bishop, and he's not a good guy. And he rules through fear and through just sheer power. But he doesn't have respect. He doesn't have love. He doesn't have all these things that really not only a leader should have, but especially a religious leader should have. And so there's several times in the book where if he had just been kind to people, perhaps his leadership would be different. And Ragna knows how to be stern and forceful when it calls for it, but she also knows how to be empathetic and sweet and helpful. And I really thought the exploration of what makes a good leader was an excellent aspect of this book. Again, if you've read the other books in the series, you know how much we hate William, you know how much we hate Ralph. That's how you will feel about Wilwolf and Winston and Wiglum. However, the three of those brothers, it's kind of the evilness is split between the three of them. So as a result, you don't feel quite the antagonism to a single brother, to a single one of them, although you will feel that mostly towards Winston, but it's kind of spread out. So you don't have a singular antagonist that you just hate their guts in this book. And that made it a little bit differently. It it keeps the formula, but it changes it so slightly so you don't feel like you're just reading the same story over and over again. I've talked in my previous reviews of this series about the gratuitousness of the graphic nature of the book. And I've had people say, oh, I don't think their books are that gratuitous at all. You could absolutely tell these stories, tell these empathetic things, and still fade to black, or still not be explicit with the story that you're telling. And Ken Follett continues to be very explicit in this book. And the first half of the book, not quite as much. So the first half of the book, I was like, this is actually not that bad. I mean, it still had some of that stuff in there, but it wasn't as bad as in the other books. So I was like, that's not bad. And then the second half of the book, it's like he was like saving it all for then. And I was just like, man, why did you have to do that? That just made it so difficult to read. And so I didn't love that aspect of the book, and I wish that he would change. But if wishes were horses. So that's one thing that keeps this series from being, as even higher is some of that stuff. I will also say that I really found the discussion of the king's power and whether the king lets his lords rule and when it's the king's role to step in and overrule his lords. The king here, I think it's Ethelwild. He's not even in the book much, so you don't really remember his name much. But the king here does not step in often. He is just kind of like, I'm gonna fine you all this money, and you're not gonna pay it. And it's like, dude, get off your butt and get to work. And it's really funny that he doesn't, and he becomes kind of cartoonishly incompetent in some ways. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book as a whole. I think that Ken Follett really just knows how to enrapture me. Again, I just read it so fast because I had time, but B, because, I just couldn't put it down, and I was really caring about it. I still have criticisms, very similar to my criticisms of the other books, but because it's the formula and the formula works, I also really enjoy the book. So Ken Follett continues to be an amazing writer, and I will continue reading his books, although I wish he would tone down the graphic nature of them. So that is my opinion of The Evening and the Morning. Let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section down below, and until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.